Hi, this is Cheryl Gallant, your Conservative Member of Parliament for the riding of Algonquin, Renfrew-Pembroke, where promises made are expected to be kept. I really thought that things would be different with the new Prime Minister. I had high hopes. Despite Carney's claim to being new and different, it's still the same old Liberal Party. One of the worst Liberal habits is to make announcements without having a plan in place to follow through. For Liberals, the announcement is the policy. The announcement generates positive headlines on the front pages of the major newspapers. The follow-up stories reporting the Liberals had no plans to actually do what they said they were going to do end up on the back pages. The Liberals' recent defense spending announcement is a prime example. Carney claimed he was increasing defense spending by $9 billion, and the Canadian Armed Forces would be getting a 20% pay hike. The next day, in an interview with News Talk 1010 radio, Defense Minister McGuinty said, quote, "It's about a 20% pay increase immediately for our members," end quote. This was the first sign that the government was not being honest with Canadians. In one day, the pay raise had gone from 20% to about 20%. Now, he did say the pay raise would be immediate. Naturally, when the women and men in uniform saw nothing had changed on their next paychecks, they began to ask questions. A reporter contacted the department to ask when the 20% pay hike would be happening. The minister's office did not answer the question. Okay. What the minister's office did say was worse. Quote, "This investment represents an almost 20% pay increase to the overall CAF compensation envelope, and the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces are actively working on how to best implement this investment, looking at options that include a combination of approaches, such as retention bonuses for stress trades, increasing starting salaries for junior members, and a broad-based salary increase," end quote. This is a long way from what the Prime Minister said when he announced a 20% pay hike for the Canadian Armed Forces. They got those headlines. For Carney, it was mission accomplished. For those who actually go on missions, they'll have to wait and see what the Liberals actually decide. Last week, I wrote to the minister on behalf of my constituents serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, asking when our warriors would receive their pay raises and how much would they be getting. It's now been a month since the announcement, and the Liberals still have no answers. This doesn't seem to bother them, since the announcement was the policy. Now, it looks like the Liberals might be backtracking on increasing defense spending altogether. In a series of strategic leaks this week, the Liberals are signaling to reporters that major cuts to public spending are coming. This came in the form of a letter from the finance minister to his cabinet colleagues. In the letter, the minister directs each department to cut 7.5% of their budget for the next fiscal year. That will be followed by a 10% cut the next year and a 15% cut in the third year. The Liberals are sending a signal that steep cuts are coming, but they're looking to deflect the blame. See if you spot the fall guy. Here's a quote from the Globe and Mail. Quote, "A senior government official outlined the plan to the Globe and Mail and provided excerpts of the letters. A second senior government official confirmed aspects of the letters. The Globe is not identifying the senior officials so that they could not comment on a matter that has not been publicly announced. At last month's NATO Leader Summit, Mr. Carney pledged that Canada would spend as much as $150 billion annually on defense within a decade, equivalent to 5% of the country's gross domestic product. That's a much higher level of defense spending than outlined in the Liberal Party's election campaign platform, which still laid out larger annual deficits than had been forecasted in the Liberal government's December fiscal update. End quote. Here's an example, or here's an excerpt from the version of the story in the Toronto Star. Quote, the Carney government also announced it would aggressively ramp up the annual defense budget with an extra $9 billion in the current fiscal year, and billions more in annual spending to come after Canada agreed in June to a new target with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And that would see all members of the alliance spend the equivalent of 5% of their economic output on defense and defense-related initiatives by 2035. The core defense commitment alone, at 3.5% of Canada's gross domestic product, could require at least another $40 billion per year in federal dollars devoted to the military, depending on how the economy fares over the next decade. Carney alluded to federal spending changes to accommodate the defense boost at the NATO summit in the Netherlands on June 25th. Quote, if we're moving to a higher and higher levels of defense spending because that's necessary, then we will have to make considerations about what less the federal government can do in certain cases and how we're going to pay for it. End quote, he told the reporters at The Hague. It's clear the Liberals want their socialist voters to know that these cuts are because of the defense budget. Right now, socialist Canadians support increased defense spending because to socialists, the United States is enemy number one. That is, until it comes at the expense of their gravy train. That the Liberals are telegraphing so far in advance that deep cuts might be coming and that those cuts should be blamed on the Defense Department because the Liberals want left-wingers to protest and make a stink in the media. Carney even claimed that the commitment he made at the recent NATO summit was maybe something that he was going to do. So he said that the commitment he made was going to be 5%, and it would require a social license. Now, social license is the same made-up term that Justin Trudeau used to kill the planned Energy East pipeline. Now, there's no such thing as social license. Society does not hand out licenses to government. It's just code for things that are politically popular and poll well. Carney's clearly stating that the necessary increases in defense spending will only happen if it's popular to do so. We can expect the taxpayer-funded media, and especially the CBC, to do endless stories this summer warning of the consequences of cuts to the public service, especially since the biggest cuts aren't scheduled for another 3 years. If the Liberals were actually serious about cutting government, they'd put the biggest cuts up front in the first year. That would give them time to rebuild political support before an election. Instead, they're claiming they'll make the biggest cuts in a possible election year. Don't believe them. What the Liberals really want to do is raise taxes. Last week, the C.D. Howe Institute suggested the hikes in defense spending could be funded with a 2% increase in the GST. It won't come close to covering it, the cost. The Liberals will take their cues from bank robbers and reporters. They'll go where the money's at, the homes and the retirement savings of baby boomers. Rest assured, we will fight any new taxes. Live from Ottawa, this is Cheryl Gallant.
All right.
That was kind of rough.